right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Kate. I'm the readings coordinator at Elliott Bay Book Company, and I'm your host for tonight's event. Elliott Bay is located on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish. And on behalf of the staff of Elliott Bay, we appreciate you tuning into this program. I'm really excited to virtually welcome Bushra Rehman for a reading of and a conversation about her new novel, Roses in the Mouth of a Lion. It's a poignant and funny and really compelling queer coming of age story with a young protagonist that you will just find yourself rooting for the whole time. She's going to be joined in conversation tonight with her by her friend and collaborator and fellow author, Daisy Hernandez. After I introduce tonight's guests, Bushra will give a short reading, and then she and Daisy are going to chat for a little while, and then we'll open up to an audience Q&A. So please just help us stay organized by posting your questions in the Q&A box and then comments in the chat box. All right, so let's go on to tonight's guests. So let's start with Daisy Hernandez. She is the author of The Kissing Bug, a true story of a family, an insect, and a nation's neglect of a deadly disease. This book just won the 2022 Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and it was also selected as an inaugural title for the National Book Foundation's Science Plus Literature program. Daisy is also the author of the award-winning memoir, A Cup of Water Under My Bed, and co-editor of Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism. The former editor of Color Lines magazine, she has reported for the New York Times, National Geographic, The Atlantic, and Slate, and she's an associate professor at Miami University in Ohio. All right, our guest of honor tonight, Bushra Rehman, grew up in Corona, Queens. She is co-editor of Colonize This, Young Women of Color on Today's Feminism, and author of the poetry collection, Mariana's Beauty Salon, and the dark comedy, Corona, which was one of the New York Public Library's favorite books about New York City. And I truly have to imagine that they're going to say the same about Roses in the Mouth of a Lion. It is such a wonderful portrait of New York in the 80s and just like a really great slice of life of a family and a community. And it's also just a really wonderful book about female friendship, which I love to see. And I also love to see that tonight we have two amazing friends that are going to be in conversation. So please join me in virtually welcoming Bushra and Daisy.
Hey.
Hey everyone. Oh, Bushra, I'm so excited to do this with you.
I know.
And I just want to start by saying I love this book so much. I know Karen Russell said it first, maybe I loved every moment. And I also agree that I loved every moment. And so, yeah, let's start with you reading, and then I have a bunch of questions. And then I'll invite folks in the audience to also drop your questions in the Q&A or the chat box, wherever you're comfortable. And I'll turn off my camera so that we can focus on you. And where are you going to be reading from?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Daisy, for being here. I was just so excited. You know, we love talking. So you're going to get a little bit of that tonight. And I thought I'd read a little bit, just a short chapter. It's about 7 minutes. And it comes from a little bit later in the book, but it is about Razia and her best friend, Taslima. And they are growing up in a Orthodox Muslim community, and they are not allowed to listen to American pop music. So you got to just know that to get the context of this chapter. It's called Clock Radio. On Saturday mornings, I went to Taslima's house as early as possible so I could catch Casey Kasem's American Top 40. We were like junkies at the racetrack. If our songs were called, we felt we were winning. When our songs fell behind, we were personally insulted. Taslima got away with listening to music in a way I never could. She had a mother who wasn't as religious, a door she could lock, and a clock radio. Well, it was Eliza's clock radio. Their father had given it to her sister Eliza so she could get to Flushing High School on time, not realizing that now Eliza, and by extension me and Taslima, could listen to music as much as we wanted with just the press of a button and the turn of a dial. We listened every second we got, the volume turned down low. I loved that clock radio. The time was told in neon red digits. There were smooth buttons all along its light purple surface. Not light purple, Taslima always insisted, making fun of the way Eliza said it. Lavender. One Saturday, we were propped up on Taslima's pillows, our heads close to the clock radio. Our talking was interrupted by the pre-recorded chorus, Casey's Coast to Coast, and the distinct rasp of his voice. Hello again, and welcome to American Top 40. My name is Casey Kasem, and we're counting down the Billboard's top hits. These are the records you're buying and record stations are playing all across America as rated by Billboard magazine. I turned to Taslima. Isn't it a catch-22? The radio plays the songs people buy, and people buy the songs the radio plays. God, ever since you read Catch-22, you think everything's a Catch-22. I'm going to tell Eliza to stop lending you her books. The chorus sang, American Top 40, and Casey Kasem continued. Now, what you've been waiting for, this week's #1 song in the land. We sat up excited. I Think We're Alone Now from the album Tiffany. That's the girl herself, 16-year-old Tiffany with I Think We're Alone Now. Taslima and I jumped out of bed. For weeks, we've been doing endless renditions in front of the mirror. Even though we made fun of the way Tiffany danced, it ended up becoming the way we danced, putting our hands through our hair, winking, and doing a weird herky-jerky wave with our chests. We strained our voices trying to hit Tiffany's high notes. Feel free to sing along. I think we're alone now. Doesn't seem to be anyone around. I think we're alone now. The beating of our hearts is the only sound. There was a banging on the door. It was Eliza. Taslima, what are you doing in there? It sounds like an earthquake, and you're not alone. We can all hear you. We turned off the radio, but couldn't stop laughing. Eliza banged again. I told you a million times not to play with my radio. I mean clock, me. We heard her run downstairs, but we knew Eliza wouldn't really tell because then the radio would be taken away and Eliza wouldn't be able to listen to music either. We lay down in the bed, out of breath, not opening the door in case Eliza was waiting outside to pounce. After a few minutes, there was a knock. My God, what does a girl have to do around here to have some peace and quiet? Taslima whispered in an exaggerated voice like Blair from Facts of Life. I broke into more laughter. The knock came again, gentle this time. Taslima? Abu? We sat up and she quickly turned off the radio and opened the door. Instead of coming inside, Taslima's father stood outside and peered in. He was different from the other fathers. He read Urdu poetry, kept a vegetable garden, and cooked the most delicious biryani. For the last few years, he'd been sick with an illness no one understood. His work clothes hung on his skeletal frame. Razia, he acted like he hadn't seen me in forever, when the truth was I spent more time at Taslima's house than I spent at mine. Assalamu alaikum, uncle. Wa alaikum assalam. He smiled at me, then turned to Taslima. Beta, what are you doing? Taslima looked at the clock radio guiltily. Nothing, Abu. She tried to change the subject. Are you going to work? Ah, yes, work. He sighed and came into the bedroom. Did I ever tell you about my first job when I came to America? Uncle took any excuse to sit down and tell a story. He sat now on the edge of the bed. Taslima and I moved over. You know those places that make food very quickly? You mean fast food, Abu? His eyes lit up. Yes. You worked at McDonald's? I was amazed. He shook his head. No, the one with the girl with the red hair. Wendy's? That's the one. It was my first day. So the manager gave me an easy job. He said, you wash the dishes. So I gathered all the dishes. He imitated carrying a large stack of plates and put them in the sink. Then boom, Uncle blew his hands up in the air. The sink exploded. What? Why? Taslima and I burst out. I thought it was a sink, but it was really a deep fryer. You know where they make the French fries? Yes, Abu, I know, but how did you not know? You know American sinks are full of dirty water with dishes soaking in them. I thought it was water, not oil. He shook his head. The manager was so angry they had to close down the kitchen and throw out the oil, very dirty oil. They used it for months. The manager said to me, you're fired. But I didn't speak English well then. I didn't know what fired meant. I thought he was saying I started a fire, so I nodded yes. Taslima and I both were trying not to crack up. Well, after that day, the manager was going on vacation. I just kept coming every day. After 2 weeks, the manager returned. I still didn't know I had no job. I just knew this was the man who was angry at me. So when I saw him, I hid under a table. The manager saw me and said, you, what are you doing here? I fired you weeks ago. We couldn't hold it in any longer. Taslima and I burst into laughter, Imagining her father getting caught hiding under a table, Taslima's father smiled. It was always this way with our fathers. They made stories of cruelty seem so funny. The digits of the clock radio caught his attention. Okay, beta, it's time for me to go. He patted his thighs a few times as if he was revving himself up, then lifted himself slowly. He smiled, looked at the clock radio, and said to Taslima, right before walking out the door, "You're never alone, beta. You'll always have me." He was so thin then, walking away from us, the shadow of the young man inside him tugging at his sleeves. And that is the end of the chapter Clock Radio. I feel like I could hear you laughing, Daisy. I don't know. I know you were muted, but
I was. I'm so glad that you chose this particular chapter because I remember Casey Kasem.
Yes.
I love the way you you captured, and I remember that Tiffany song, but just the way you captured that cultural experience of listening to it and that feeling of, winning when it was like the song that you wanted was the top one that week. And then that ending, when I read it on my own initially, just brought tears to my eyes at the end. It was and so actually I wasn't planning to ask you about humor, but because there's so much humor in this particular chapter, maybe we could start there because I feel like this was such a great example actually of the book, like that I would be laughing or smiling or giggling and then suddenly, without knowing it, you would really very subtly shift into like, a social cultural observation, like, that line about, they made stories of cruelty seem so funny, these pieces that, as adults, we come to understand. But I just think humor is so hard. And I know I feel like it comes naturally to you, but I'm wondering like, how you balanced in the drafting and revising of like the humor and also like the really difficult moments.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I think you're very funny as well, Daisy. We laugh a lot together. Humor is such a survival tool, technique. And I think that, as a child of immigrants, watching the community that I grew up in, people were laughing so much that if I now look back on it and think like, oh my God, that was so hard. Like everything we were doing was so hard. Everything they were doing, raising 6 kids, like in a 1.5 bedroom apartment, like working all these jobs, like struggling with the shock of arrival, that phrase of just when you from Miranire, is it? Not Miranire, but I will get it. The idea of that pain and grief that the adults were going through, and yet how they were often laughing and telling stories and really just love telling stories. And as you know, I love laughter. And so I knew that this book I wanted it to be funny. And I knew that it would be the other characters like in Razia's life who would make it funny. If I simply just channeled some of the dialogue from those friends and those uncles and those aunties and even the mom sometimes, if I just channeled some of that dialogue. Mina Alexander, thank you, Sunu. Thank you. Yes, so I just knew I wanted it to have all those elements.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because Razia is like she has like a very serious side and a very like philosophical side and very observant. And so I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Like the humor is often in the friendships and in the connections with others for sure throughout it. So I want to talk about poetry because when we first met, I knew you as a poet before a short story writer and a novelist. And I was actually just even the title itself, I feel like, there's a poet here. But I'm wondering like, I feel like your work has been getting longer, right? Like it was like poems and then short stories and now like a novel. But are there practices that you bring from poetry to writing prose and to this project specifically, such a longer commitment?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, Daisy, I think we met when I was doing like open mics of poetry in the city. And New York City. And yeah, so the book started with, I also teach poetry in the public schools, and I work a lot with teens and children. And so a classic poem we would always teach is Willie Perdomo's Where I'm From poem, in which he celebrates, an urban neighborhood and kind of like brings in all the sights and sounds. And, Corona, where most of the action takes place, is an under-resourced neighborhood that, many people would just look at and just like write off, and yet we are people living there. We're not just a place to go get food and cheap rent. There's communities there. And so it was so important for me to write about these communities. And one day I was just with my students and I did the Where I'm From poem. And so, and so that's the opening of the book, is that exact poem that I wrote with the students that day. And from that, it just opened up all these memories of Corona. And what's interesting about your question is that I wrote a book called Corona, and when I wrote it, it's a bunch of vignettes, short fiction, and I was writing a working poet when I wrote that. And then when I came back to this material and I had to re-enter that world, I was having a really hard time making it poetic again because I was a prose writer now, and I had to start writing poetry again. In order to write this book, I had to start writing poetry again, and all that poetry is not shared. It's all just it was all just for me, but I had to remember what it felt like to write poetry, and then I could write prose like this again. And I think that, as you can see, like even in that piece, it's structured like a poem. You start with the clock radio, and then how do you know a chapter is winding down? It's you return to that image of the clock radio, and yet now that image has taken on a whole other meaning. Once it's the father now talking, looking at it, and we have like this one object. Poetry is so much about the physical world and the objects in it, at least in my mind. And so that clock radio is just such a symbol of so much for them. So yeah, I think I was definitely, but I think I did have to write poetry again. And I thank BIPOC Writing Party, which was this during the pandemic, this every Monday night gathering of BIPOC writers, and we would write poetry and prose together. And so I did a lot of poetry writing there.
Oh, fantastic. I love it.
Thanks for that question.
Yeah. So it's a novel that is so much about friendship. And so I love that you chose this particular chapter to share with us too, because their friendship is just so powerful and so sweet and so like central in a lot of ways to the novel. And so I was also thinking and really noticing as I read that Racia's mother, her friendships are also such a big part of this book. And I also grew up in an immigrant family, very different immigrant family, but the book it took me back to my own childhood and just, watching my mom and her friends while we were with our friends. And there's just such wonderful moments of in your novel of like, oh wow, they really are paying attention to like they do know where
they knew what we were doing.
Yeah, like meanwhile we thought we were like free wild animals around the house or something. But I'm curious, like what you feel like you learned or that Racia learned from watching like the women and like watching those adult friendships, because they're such a vital part of the book as well. So I feel like that was very intentional on your part.
Yeah, well, it took me some time to put these pieces together, but I realized that, I'm very much all about chosen family, queer chosen family. And then I realized that my parents had been doing chosen family the whole time, because when they immigrated here, as South Asians, we were in the country hundreds of years ago, and then we were banned from this country until the late 60s. And then the only people who could come were people with like degrees, right? In like medicine or science, which is where this whole model minority myth comes from. You should definitely read the book Karma of Brown Folk, of the way that South Asians were pitted against other Black and brown folks who were in this country, and how that was about immigration policy, And so a lot of the aunties and uncles, and they're not my blood family, but I call them aunties and uncles. They were people who immigrated in that way, but a lot of times they were sometimes the only people who were educated. Like my dad, youngest of 12 kids, everyone worked to get him educated, right? So other people in his family wouldn't be able to come, but he could come, right? And then he couldn't even bring his family here, right? So family was the people that he went to college with, who all came on that, like that, contract that they got. And so a lot of my uncles were people that my dad went to like Bushra, university with, and they were kind of like going to the universities and being like getting people from the universities. And so a whole bunch of his friends came. And so they all got apartments in Brooklyn. Then they all got like places in Queens, and they did everything together, and they built a masjid together. They raised their families together, and they were very social, and it's interesting because like as a parent now, I feel like it was, it feels so upside down. Like back then it was like your friends were your parents' friends' kids, now it feels like it's the opposite. It's like you become friends with your kids' friends' parents, it just somehow doesn't work the same. It's not as much fun, I will say. Oh, I hope nobody's listening to this. But I mean, it was just like we could see our parents like modeling like friendship, and like real friendship, like lending each other money, being there, taking care of each other, housing each other when people didn't have places to live. Our living room there was always someone sleeping in the living room. We were always housing someone, so I think that they really showed me just what community is like, and that communities must share joy as well as sorrow. And Daisy, you and I talked a lot about this because our book is a political book about community organizing. Just that idea that we need to share happy times as well as sad times to not burn out, and I would witness that with them.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. This book it's such a love letter to Queens, to Corona, to the East Village. It's just such a love letter to the city. And I feel like your sense of, bringing place into your poetry, like you talked about, has been there, from the beginning. And it did make me wonder, like, why are places so powerful? Especially when we think about childhood, because I just felt like, I'm like, have I been to Corona? I don't know. I felt at the end of this, I felt like I had been there, and I feel like, oh, my memories of my own childhood are so intense. And yeah, so I'm like, what is it about these places? Is it because we spent our childhoods there? What is it that like gives them such significance? And then I did wonder, this is like the little journalist in me is like, oh, did you go back? Like what kind of, what did you do in terms of place and setting to like, refamiliarize yourself with these places?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, so I think, that's it's a deep question, right? And it made me realize that Daisy did send me some of these questions earlier to help me prepare, but children are so present. We as adults, I'm like relearning how to be mindful and present, and children are just so present. And when you're present, time just expands, and so like childhood feels like it just is so long. And I think even when I was writing the book, I was just like, was that just like one summer? I feel like so many things happened. But it's just like you're able to just be very, very present. And so you just get imprinted so much more than if you're just like in your world, as we can be as adults and not paying attention, So I think that was it. But of course I am an adult, so I was actually teaching in Queens. I was teaching high school in Corona and in East Elmhurst when I was writing part of the book. So I was with high school students in Queens. I was taking the train still. I was still hanging out with friends, in Jackson Heights, and I was still in Queens a lot. I would ride the 7 train back and forth taking notes. And so there's this one moment on the 7 train that there's a part of the 7 train where it bends around a track, and it is terrifying. You really think this train is going to fall off. And I would ride back and forth, and I was like, I can't believe they never fixed this. It's still like this. It's still going to fall off the track. And yet it never falls off the track. I mean, hopefully it will never fall off the track, but it's a really scary part of the 7 train. And but I would go to places, I would take photographs, I would just sit and journal, and really, really like a journalist, you know, just take down all the notes. And one funny thing is that I did that. There is a scene in Grand Central, and I spent a lot of time in Grand Central, you know, taking pictures of there's these beautiful constellations on the ceiling, and I would take photos and I would write about the constellations, and there's all these conversations Razia had with Angela about the constellations. And then I remembered that at that time you couldn't see the constellations because the ceiling was black in the 80s or 90s, and it was black from pollution and cigarette smoke and ash and just dirt. Like, it was just disgustingly dirty, and you actually couldn't see the constellations at the time period. So I had to delete all those scenes and chapters. So yeah, sometimes you have to remember history.
That brings up an interest. Well, you know what? I'm going to invite people, if folks want to share where they are, since we're talking about place or
Yeah,
your childhood place or where you are today. I think you can put it into the chat box. I could be wrong about that, but I think so. But that's fascinating, because it does bring up the question for me, because this is based in an actual place, an actual community and so forth, but it's not nonfiction. So like what kind of I guess fidelity did you feel to, like, you know, having it be Casey
Oh, I listened to all his old radio programs and transcribed them, and there was actually a lot more that then we were like, okay, this is total copyright infringement, we cannot include all this. But you know, I listened to a lot. You can find all of them, his old radio shows, and it really brought me back. And then there's also these little hidden secret things, like, you know, Casey Kasem was an Arab man. It's like actually Casey Kasem, you know, and
oh
you
my
know,
God, I just learned something.
also,
Okay,
you know, she was also Arab, you know, Arab background, you know, so Tiffany as well. I can't remember. I think.
Well, I know that everyone is happy they came tonight, because they might not have known this information.
Yeah, and so there's all this kind of stuff, like, you know, George Michael, who's a big character. He was a Cyprian immigrant, and you know, even though we know him as like George Michael, he was actually like a Cyprian immigrant in England who was bullied, you know, for being different, and you know, so there's all these kind of, when I was doing research, the more I would find, the more. You know, writing about Whitney Houston, and then that doc coming out about Whitney Houston, and that she was possibly also, you know, bi and closeted. And so yeah, I just think I liked putting in a lot of just like queer history, as well as New York City history, and you know, Arab Muslim history in there as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like that was really important to you, to actually have it, not to like make up a radio host or something like that, like some fidelity to recreate the experience, I'm assuming.
Yes. And then people can connect to it. Like, a lot of people are connecting, you know, they may be from a very different background, but they grew up in the 80s, or it's shocking how many people still know that song. Maybe it's not shocking, but I mean, people love that song still. I guess it's like on karaoke. I have no idea, but like people still know all the words, you know.
Oh yeah, TikTok at this point.
True. Oh, TikTok. Yeah, TikTok brought it back.
Yeah, people have stayed. No, I mean, it's a great song.
It is a great song. It is a really good song. It's true.
It is a good song. It is.
Oh, she did not write it though. It was like the Shondells, and so it was like she did a reboot of it or whatever.
Reimagining of it. So we worked on Colonize This together twice now.
We did, yeah.
And you're a wonderful editor. I love getting your feedback on my work. So I'm curious, like, you know, how was it editing yourself for this novel, or like bringing on that, you know, editor hat? It sounds like, I mean, I was hearing you say like there was like actual stuff you had to let go of because it wasn't accurate to the 1980s, you know, so there was some stuff, maybe some decisions that were more straightforward. But how is it, you know, how was that self-editing process before you got to your editor?
I'm an editor who loves editing, and you're an amazing editor as well. Of course, we all know this. But I think that there's this way that because I know I'm going to edit, and I do see editing as a creative process. I can be as messy and wild and out there and everything in my first drafts. Like, I do not hold back when I'm writing a first draft of a story or a scene. I just put everything in there because I know editor Bushra will take care of it, So I get to be like Bushra, who just says whatever she wants. And then like later, I mean, this is the Gemini part, right? Then like editor Bushra will come in and be like, okay, that needs to be cleaned, that needs to be cleaned. And I think like I never throw anything out. It all just goes into this file that I may or may never look at it again. But I feel like it's not gone, it's just somewhere else. But I do think of it as a creative process, and doing Colonize This is what inspired me to write Corona, which then the novel Corona, the collection Corona, that then led to this novel, because just hearing those personal stories from all those writers and the impact that it would have on me and the impact it had on readers, it just reminded me like how powerful it is to write personal stories that other people can read and feel seen in, and I've already been hearing from readers that they just feel seen in ways with this book that they're very grateful for, whether it's because they're Pakistani or Muslim or grew up in the 80s or South Asian or had a mom like that or a dad like that or a friend like that, it's something very powerful, and I think it's healing. And I know that right now, anecdotally and in other ways, the suicide rate is rising among teenagers in Muslim communities, and I think that it is. I know this anecdotally, and I know that there's also a lot of preaching happening about sexuality, So, and this is of course obviously not just in this religion; it's in many religions, unfortunately. But I do feel like a book can be something that someone could find and feel that they're not alone, which, a lot of times people would tell us about Colonize This, right? That they read it and then they just felt like less alone, in their college or in their hometown or wherever they were. And I think that I hope, I want this book to help in that way.
Yeah. Oh, I would have loved to have had this book as a young person. I love having it as an adult, but as a young person, because I think that you've just created this character who is like, just like, she's just so fantastic. Like, I feel like, because she's smart and she's observant, of what's happening, the all the contradictions, but she has language for it and half language and is developing language. And she wants more, but she also like really loves her family and really loves her community. So there's just the complexity is like, to have that on the page is like such a gift. I also really love, I'm going to think about that. Like, I'm also a Gemini. So
yes.
I'm going to think about the what was it, like editor
Daisy, but editor Bushra will take care of it.
Yeah, I love that.
Write whatever you want, do it, go anywhere.
She'll deal with that. Yeah. I'm going to remind folks, if you want to put questions in the Q&A box, it's down there on your screens, or if you want to put it into the chat box, I'm happy to also include your questions, because I can talk about this book for hours as well. I did want to talk about religion. It was just for me, such a powerful part of this book. And it tied to all the other things that we've been talking about in terms of friendship, in terms of humor, in terms of chosen family and how that gets created. And at the same time, it's not this, I feel like, and this might just be me, but I feel like it's actually hard to write a character who doesn't just completely turn away from the religion, and I say this as somebody who grew up in Catholicism, and I don't practice it anymore, but I don't have I'm not a recovered Catholic. I don't have I didn't need to turn away from it forcefully. It just didn't speak to me the same way that other practices spoke to me. Mm-hmm. And so I saw so much of myself also in this experience, because she so clearly has her own relationship with Allah. She has But there's her mother as well, who's like a huge part. But I feel like her mother also has this like very powerful, like religious and maybe also like spiritual relationship, right? As well. So I'm wondering like how you, like how you wrote about that. Like, were you just like, okay, this is like, I got this, like, I've been thinking about this for like my entire life, and it was because there's just so much complexity there. And you also show what I loved so much too. I'm sorry, I'm like going to go on.
No, I love
it. Is also, just the other girls in the community. I feel like everyone in this book got to have their own relationship. And oh my gosh, like that just, again, like, I'm like, yes, like me and my posse, like we all had our own relationship, like I was like painfully honest when I went to confession in the Catholic and my friend told lies. I was like, oh my God, So we just like all like, and I feel like all the girls here got to have their own relationship and their own entry point and their own like figuring it out, kind of experience. And I'm like, that's hard to do. I think that's hard to do. But I wonder like, how much, I also wondered if there were chapters or scenes that you cut away, because I could see like, I could also see it becoming the entire book. Like it's so powerful. It's such a powerful part of this book.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much like stuff I cut out. One day I will have to look at that because editor Bushra is very strict about things. But
Bushra.
I know now it's gonna be a thing. So it was really, really important for me to write a book in which the main character had a strong relationship to Islam, to her spirituality, and was also queer, that she didn't have to reject that spiritual tradition in order to be who she was. And in some of the chapters, she's talking to Allah about her queerness, about everything. It was kind of like a, are you there, God? It's me, Margaret type of situation, for her. And
1980s book.
1980s book, yeah. Is it Judy? I'm getting all my authors. Is it Judy Bloom?
Yeah, that was Judy Bloom.
Okay.
I think so. Someone could correct us in the chat.
Yes, please. Sunu, are you there? But
fact checkers.
I know, we're just saying whatever. Yeah, this is not fact checking Bushra who's here tonight. It's wild Bushra. So I think it was really important for me for so many reasons. One, as I was saying to someone the other day, like anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, they are so prevalent in this country. There's so much behind of like what the shadow self of the personality of this country, right? So I just didn't want to add more. Thank you, Sunu. You are saying it's Bloom. I just didn't want to add to more fuel to that fire, of another book that could just be like, right, look at those Muslim people, they are so oppressed. And I think people do have such a blind spot, if you talk about being queer and your family having a hard time with it, people are like, oh yeah, Muslims, Islam. And I'm like, all of your religions do that, hello, who's, my bestest friend who was, one of them, like, who was Italian and Catholic, like, oh my God, what she had to go through with her family, I just think that I have, this book took me 10 intense years, probably 20 if I really think about it. So I changed a lot in that time. I think I would have written a very different book 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. And, when I read Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis, which is it's a graphic novel, and she had this kind of relationship to a Muslim God in that book, it was the first time I'd ever seen that. And like my jaw just dropped. I was like, oh my God, she's talking to Allah the way that I used to talk to Allah. Like just this kind of, just this connection to a higher power, to a spiritual force outside of myself. And I definitely didn't have that in my life for a while. And in the last few years, and as you know, my dad was very, very sick, and I was with him a lot and taking care of him and with the rest of my family. And I just started practicing again. I'm not saying that I'm like a fully practicing Muslim, but it was to make him happy. Just like, God, he's dying. Would it hurt me to just pray one time so he could see me praying? Like, it's all he really wants. Like, why am I going to be stubborn? And then when I started to do that, I was like, oh, this is actually kind of nice. It all came back like, so it came back. And I don't agree with so much with any monotheistic religion, but I definitely am trying to take those practices and make them my own. And I know there will be people who say that you can't do that, but you know what? It's like, it's just between me and my God, right? It's really, and that is something that Islam does practice, is that it is always between the individual and their higher power. It's no one can tell you how that is. And of course, obviously politics, patriarchy, fascism, ignorance lead to lots of misinterpretations of all religions. And unfortunately for this one too.
Yeah, you're just reminding me of a conversation that I had with a writer years ago where we were talking about like, well, I'll speak for myself. Like I will go into Catholic churches, and I really like to go when, not during the services, but just, in between services. And my friend and I were talking about how it's like, well, it's just so imprinted, like kind of like place, as you were talking about, from childhood. So like I have a positive association with churches. So it feels like a sacred space when I go there, even though like I'm not doing in my case, I'm not doing any of the prayers. I'm doing more of like the personal prayer, I guess. But there's something there about that experience from childhood. I love that moment when you said, just it all came back like, oh, this is kind of nice. that there was comfort there, because I feel like that was also such an important part of this book, that there was a certain kind of solace and connection that was happening in those like moments of like spirituality.
And it's cruel to cut people off from their spirituality. And I think that is something, it's a form of violence to tell people that they cannot be spiritual.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's powerful. I haven't thought about that, but yeah, you're absolutely right. It feels like a very basic human right.
Yeah. And sometimes we, you and me and others, we have to come back to it.
Yeah.
But then why did we ever have to get cut off from it? It's just it's important to think about.
You're making me you reminded me a few years ago, my partner and I went to Catholic services around Christmas. And we had heard it was a queer friendly church. We weren't sure what that meant, but it was like, wow, it's really, you do have to navigate it in a different way, especially as a queer couple. Like it felt weird. Like it was like, well, I don't know if I really should hold your hand in this place that I still have all these other associations with, even though it feels really sacred for me by myself. Yeah. But then with a queer coupleship, it's different, right? So yeah, that's deep.
Yeah. And there, as we all know, there is this magic in the universe, and there's so much going on that we have no idea what it is. And I think that spiritual practices are ways that people kind of funnel some of that magic. And it's definitely not the only way. And the Met was one of the places I went to a lot to research the book. And one of the things I discovered is that the part of Pakistan my family is from was Buddhist. And the hottest Buddhas you would ever believe.
Love it.
I'll send some pictures. And I was just like, oh my God, before this, the invasions of this area, like I was Buddhist. And, those practices are, I guess I'm like, as people say, they're a Jubu or a Chubu, or I'm a Mubu, like I'm a Muslim who's, and but when
sorry,
I don't know where the Chu came from. A Catholic,
okay,
Catholic. I don't know where that. But I just was like, oh, that's why my ancestors were Buddhist. If I really go back, they were Buddhist, and that's how they practiced. And it's one of the benefits of getting older, I feel, is when you start to really get back in touch with spirit.
Yeah, and I really heard you like describing like putting pieces together in a different way than you would have like 10 or, as you were saying, 20 years ago. Yeah. I would love to hear more about creating the mom character, because I'm assuming that you cut out a lot.
Yes.
I'm just basing that on when I've written my own fictional mother characters. It's like can really go there, but I'm curious. yeah, how that was.
I mean, again, this would have been a different book 10 years ago or 20 years, like before I had a kid, it would have been a different book.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think that, and I've just been quoting this at every reading because I just think this book is so amazing. E.J. co-wrote a book called The Magical Language of Others. And in it, it's a young writer and she's getting advice from a writing mentor. And she's written all these like poems about her mother and her grandmother, and she's really angry. And the person is just like, yeah, you gotta, and she was just like, in order for something to be poetry, and you have to forgive the person you're writing about, or you have to forgive yourself for not forgiving them. And so I know, and I just kept that, I think I kept that near my desk about writing about, not just the mother character, but a lot of the characters. Like I needed to, I mean, and again, this is not memoir, it's autobiographical fiction, but because there's enough seeds of real people in there, and that in a way was a gift, a major gift of writing this book, and was just the level of forgiveness I experienced towards, elders in my life. And it really did help things flow.
Yeah, I don't want to do any spoilers, but so I'm like, oh, how to comment without doing spoilers. But like later in the book, there's a character who's going through a difficult time, and Rasia's mother, that was like, I thought that was like such a powerful moment where she comes in and she is really able to care for this other character, not Rasia, but another character another daughter in the community, basically. Tell me about writing that. And I also wondered if the placement of that was clear to you from the beginning, because I also felt like the placement of it pretty close to the end and like right before a huge event at the end. I think I don't review movies or whatever, right? But
I was just listening to an interview with the Glass Onion person, and like they just couldn't even talk. It was like, why are you even having this?
But I thought the placement was just so strategic on your part, because we get, I don't know, like it was almost like, I just feel like she had, and maybe I'm asking about her character arc, because I think with Rasia, like it's a coming of age story. Like we know we're gonna have this like, huge change. But I also feel like there was a change, and maybe it was more in me as a reader with the mom. I don't know if it was like, was it me? Was it her? But
everybody's changing.
Like I feel like she had like, such complexity, but also this like arc where there is a moment where she's like stepping up, in a way that's very unexpected, and that's maybe not precisely what a woman, is supposed to do in as a mother figure. But I thought that placing it close to the ending was like kind of gave that arc. I don't know if you did that intentionally, or if it was like, sometimes I know with fiction writers, like it's just clear from the beginning where it's going or how it's going to shape.
Well, that chapter for me was one of the most interesting to write, because it was the one where it was towards the end of the book. I almost had to hand it in, and I suddenly got ideas for 3 new chapters. And so that one, it came to me so fast. I remember the feeling of, I literally had to like sit down. I was like standing, and like the scenes and the images and the people and the conversations were coming in so fast that I like literally had to I was floored, and I was just trying to transcribe it as quickly as it came to me. And I think, so that chapter was a gift from some other source. And I think it did tie the book together. The interesting thing about that chapter was that the mom, I realized, and I, again, doing this book made me realize that this mother character who never learned how to read, but always encouraged her daughter to read, or didn't stop other people from stopping her to read, she's like interrupting generational trauma, a certain generational trauma. And then again, in that chapter, she's interrupting a generational trauma for another daughter in the community. But she brings in all this kind of demon mythology. And so I was actually working on a poem about, for Angie Cruz, for Asterix. I was working on this poem for that journal. And I was writing about this demon that's in many different cultures. It's called a churel. and it's like a demon woman you see on street at night. But when I started doing research, it actually turns out that churels are women who've died violent deaths who have come back for revenge. I was never told that part when I was younger. But once I learned that about that demon, it all came together. But I really enjoyed writing that chapter because editor Bushra barely had to do anything. It just, yeah, and that character,
she was happy too.
yeah, that character who the other daughter in the community really was one. You know how they say in fiction certain characters like take over, like that character was like, I need way more space in this book, like hello. I need more chapter. I need a chapter just about me.
That's so interesting you say that, because I wasn't expecting her to come back in the way that she did, and so it's so interesting. I've heard I've had my own experience with that, of characters wanting more and like coming in and demanding it. Okay,
we got a question.
Is there a question? I don't see it on mine.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure. I thought I saw a question. But if not, wow, we have 5 minutes or so left, people. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
This is the moment where I'm like, do we pause and wait for people to write their questions if they're...
Oh, so as a teacher, here's my trick. I tell them, I'm like, I'm going to count to 4 in my head. And that's it. That's the time.
Time that you get.
But I know that you had another question, Daisy, if...
Yeah, I had 2 more questions actually, like officially 2 more questions, and I have like the unofficial questions in my head. But I did wonder, like, and I know you're doing another, I've heard mention of a sequel, but I'm curious, you know, I don't know if there's writers in the audience, like this is like the moment when I would check to see if there's like writers in the audience, but I'm thinking about in the future, perhaps doing my own coming of age novel. So I'm the writer in the audience.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious, like, what were your lessons learned about writing this like coming of age novel? And part of what I loved about your book is that, and I don't know how it's getting marketed, I apologize, but like, I'm like, is it being put forward as like a YA versus, because to me, it felt like it was straddling like the YA and like the adult, literary fiction.
Well, it's a valid question, because I think one of the reasons it was almost impossible to get this book published, because all the YA editors would be like, it's too adult, and all the adult editors would say, this feels YA. I mean, that was one of many reasons why they were not publishing, but that was a big thing. It couldn't fit easily into one box or the other. And I think that it's meant for both. It's definitely meant to be for both adults and young readers. And it was originally going to be published with the YA Press, and then when they got it, they didn't like it, so that contract ended because it wasn't YA enough, and then the book was floating for a while. What I would say for anyone who's doing that kind of thing, just spend time with teenagers. Spend time with teenagers, with children. I do spend a lot of time with children through the poetry work that I was doing, teaching poetry with high school kids. And it reminded me that high school kids are I'm just going to say it, no offense to anyone, they're just smarter than adults. They're just, I just feel like a lot of times when people write YA, they are maybe writing and not spending time with young people, like they may not realize like just how intense their everyday lives are, like how much drama is happening, and how many feelings they're feeling, and how smart they are. And when I look back I have like one diary left from when I was 16, and I was like, I had such a great vocabulary. Like I can't remember anything anymore, but like I had such a great vocabulary, and I was very idealistic. There's just this way, I mean, I still am, but there's just a passion that is there with young people. And I just think spending time with young people is what I would say is the best way to write about young people.
Oh, that's so good to know. Yeah. And we have a great question about translation. If there's any
Mm.
plan for translation to Arabic or other, and I would add other languages as well.
I would love for that to happen. I honestly would love, and I know that Daisy, you've done this and you've been able to share the book with your family, when it was translated. And I think there is a part of me that would like to have it translated, definitely in Arabic, definitely in Urdu, maybe so my mom could read it, I think that I would love, I'd love to have it translated. I think that it is a book that can be translated and it will make sense because it ultimately is just about friendship and family, and sometimes the very, very difficult choices we have to make or are forced to make.
Yeah, and you are right with my my memoir. I basically had to go and find like a publisher who would be excited about translating it, and it was quite a journey. Really, it was great.
Did you? Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would be able to do the translation myself. Did you do?
No, just through word of mouth. I mean, my situation is different. Your book came out with a big house, and my memoir came out with an independent press in the US. So I basically was like, I'm just gonna find the equivalent of them
Nice.
in South America. So just through my cousin, I found out about an independent publisher. There's very few actually.
Oh, amazing.
Right, because publishing in other countries is so different from the US. So I really feel like I just got lucky that I found them, and they hired a translator who did an MFA program in the US. So he was sort of like a perfect person in a perfect position to translate. But
that's incredible. What is the title? What is the title in the translation?
It's in the memoir, it's the same. Yeah, it's still A Cup of Water Under My Bed. The Kissing Bug has not been picked up in Spanish. It's being translated into Italian, which I'm really excited about.
Books are incredible. Really,
yeah,
really
but translation is like such a anyway, it's a strange little beast. But it was so good to know that I hope more books are going to follow the path of your novel, where they're straddling this like imaginary divide that the publishing industry has, because I think like I know teenagers who have read Colonize This, and we didn't think about it for that generation at all.
I used to teach Colonize This to the high school students in Queens.
Exactly. And I feel like this is a book that I feel like, I would give to like my adult friends and also teenagers, because it's doing such amazing work for both readers. So all right, we're at time. Thank you so much.
I'm grateful one editor did take a chance though. Carolyn Blakey,
exactly. Right. That's what we need is like
you just need that one person who will
one editor who's willing to take a chance.
One editor who will believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well,
congratulations.
Thank you,
for
Daisy.
giving us this beautiful gift.
Thank you. Thanks for talking. And thank you, Elliott Bay Book Company. I mean, wow.
Thank you, Kate.
Now I want to come to Seattle for sure for AWP.
Oh, please do. It's such a joy to hear writers who are friends in conversation. Really lovely to just feel like a little, fly on the wall listening to old friends catch up. So thank you for letting us be a part of that. Everyone, please go buy Daisy's book, go buy Bushra's book. Get it through Elliott Bay, get it through your local indie bookstore. If you live in New York, go to the Strand. It features heavily in the book. So thank you both again. Wonderful book, wonderful conversation. Everybody have a great night. Take care.
Yes, thank you. Thanks. Good night. Bye.